Your fire is about to die. Rain's been falling for 6 hours straight, every branch around you is soaked through to the core, and the flame in front of you is shrinking by the minute. You flick a lighter without thinking about it. Any day of the week, half a second, done, you've already moved on. This isn't that. This is the difference between waking up tomorrow and not. You'd think the fix was obvious. Find dry wood, or just wait it out, the way you'd wait out a delayed flight or a canceled weekend plan. Except neither of those was actually an option, not when the fire was the only thing standing between your group and hypothermia, predators, and total darkness. And once you understand why, you'll never look at a lighter the same way again. Let's start with what wet wood is actually doing to a fire, on a chemical level, because almost nobody thinks about this part. Wood doesn't burn directly. What burns is the gas released when wood gets hot enough to break down, and that's the flame you're looking at. But before any of that can happen, every drop of water sitting inside that wood has to turn into steam first, and that costs a brutal amount of energy, roughly 540 calories of heat for every single gram of water, just to boil it off, before the wood fiber itself even gets a chance to reach ignition temperature. Hold a flame to a wet branch and almost all of your heat gets swallowed up fighting that water. There's nothing left over to push the wood past the point where it actually catches. You're not fighting a weak fire. You're fighting a wall of steam your flame can't punch through. You've felt a small version of this yourself, even if you never noticed it. Try lighting a barbecue with damp charcoal sometime. The lighter fluid catches, sputters, flares for a second, and dies, and you're left standing there wondering what went wrong. Now take away the lighter fluid. Take away the matches, the barbecue, the bag of dry charcoal shipped to you in plastic. Strip all of it back to a person, a rock, and a soaked forest, and you're looking at the actual problem ancient humans were solving every single time the sky opened up. Now stretch that problem across 1,000,000 years, and you start to understand what ancient humans were actually up against. The earliest solid evidence we have of humans controlling fire, not just using it after a lightning strike, but keeping it going on purpose, comes from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, dated to roughly 1,000,000 years ago. But controlling an existing flame and creating a brand new one from nothing are two completely different skills. And for an enormous stretch of our history, most people could only do the first one. At Qesem Cave in Israel, archaeologists found something remarkable. A hearth at the center of the cave, roughly 300,000 years old, with layer after layer of ash showing it, had been rebuilt and reused over and over in the exact same spot. That wasn't a fire. That was an institution. Entire groups organized their lives around keeping one flame alive across generations, because if it went out during the wrong storm, there was a real chance nobody in that cave still knew how to make another one from scratch. And depending on how far the nearest usable fire was, starting over could mean days without warmth, cooked food, or protection. So what did they actually do to keep it alive? The first trick almost every culture on Earth eventually discovered has nothing to do with tools. It's about knowing where to look. Pine trees, when they're cut, damaged, or dying, push concentrated resin down into the heartwood as a defense mechanism. Given enough years, that resin saturates the wood so completely it becomes almost waterproof. Modern survival experts call it fatwood, and it still works exactly the way it worked 100,000 years ago. Soak it in a river, shave off a curl with a blade, and it lights on the first spark because the resin repels water instead of absorbing it. Ancient humans didn't have a word for terpenes. They just knew a certain oily, orange-streaked wood kept burning when everything else failed, tested it enough times to trust it completely, and went looking for it every time the sky turned dark. That solved the problem if you happened to live near a pine tree. So what did people do everywhere else? In birch forests, in regions where pine never grew at all, they found a second answer independently, and this one is almost harder to believe. Birch bark contains a compound called betulin, packed into the papery sheets that peel off the trunk. Betulin-rich bark stays flammable even when the outside is dripping wet, because the water sits on top of it instead of soaking in, the same way rain beads on a waxed car hood instead of spreading across it. Peel a strip, hold a spark to the edge, and it catches with a hiss, burning oil instead of ordinary wood fiber. This shows up again and again across northern Europe and Siberia, in cultures that never had contact with each other, because the plant handed them the same answer wherever anyone looked hard enough. Two continents, two completely different plants. The same problem solved twice by people who never met and never compared notes, but resin and bark only solve half the equation. Neither one helps you if you don't have a spark to begin with, and getting one, reliably, on command, in a downpour, is where this story stops being about plants and starts being about something nobody expects from prehistoric humans. Chemistry. For decades, archaeologists working Neanderthal sites in France kept finding small black chunks of a mineral called manganese dioxide, and the assumption was always the same: body paint. Pigment, nothing more. It made sense. The mineral is black, it grinds into fine powder, and Neanderthals were already known to use ochre for coloring. Case closed, or so everyone thought, for years. Nobody tested it. Nobody had a strong reason to. Then in 2016, a team actually tested that assumption instead of just repeating it. They ground manganese dioxide the way the archaeological evidence suggested, mixed it into wood shavings, and tried lighting it with a spark. The results rewrote the story. Manganese dioxide isn't just black rock. It's a catalyst. It drops the temperature wood needs to ignite from roughly 350 degrees Celsius down to around 250, cutting off a 100-degree chunk of the climb using nothing but powdered stone. At a site called Pec de las Ai at least 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals weren't decorating themselves before a hunt. They were carrying Stone Age fire accelerant, sourced on purpose, ground on purpose, saved for exactly the kind of night this video opened with. For a species popular culture still draws as grunting and club swinging, that's an uncomfortable amount of applied chemistry. Somebody was running combustion experiments before Homo sapiens had even reached Europe, and it took modern researchers decades to stop assuming and finally test the rock. Knowing the right materials only gets you halfway, though. The rest came down to a job. During a storm that stretched past a single day, priorities flipped completely. Shelter wasn't first. The fire was first. Move it deeper into the cave, away from any wind or spray reaching the entrance. Shield it with hides or bundled brush. Feed it constantly but carefully. Too much fuel smothers it, too little starves it, and getting that balance wrong meant starting the entire process over with fewer dry materials left than you had an hour before. When the wood right outside was soaked, nobody waited for it to dry. They went looking for the dead lower branches on evergreen trees, tucked under a canopy that had been shedding rain for hours, bone dry underneath. And when even that ran out, they split logs open with a stone edge to reach the untouched heartwood buried beneath the wet bark, because water only ever soaks in from the outside one layer at a time. If the fire died completely anyway, groups didn't necessarily start from zero. They learned to transport a live ember instead, packed inside material that could smolder for hours without an open flame. We know this wasn't guesswork because of a man found frozen in the Alps 5,300 years later, now known as Ötzi. When researchers opened his belt pouch, they found a complete kit: tinder fungus processed to hold an ember, flint for striking sparks, extra dry plant material as backup. Call it the world's oldest fanny pack, except everyone else's life in the group depended on what was zipped inside it. None of this, by the way, was written down anywhere. There was no manual for any of it. Every piece, the resin, the bark, the powdered rock, the ember pouch, lived inside someone's memory, and it only survived by being taught, hands-on, one person to the next. Picture a child crouched at the edge of a fire during a storm just like this one, watching an adult split a wet log to reach the dry core inside. Watching them choose one branch off the ground and reject 3 others without explaining why. Watching them grind a scrap of black rock into powder and sprinkle it onto tinder before ever striking a spark. That child isn't just staying warm. They're absorbing the only copy of an entire survival technology that exists anywhere on Earth. Which means the firekeeper wasn't just tending a flame during a storm. They were the group's entire backup system for a body of knowledge that, if it died with them before it got passed on, didn't come back. You don't relearn which powdered rock lowers a spark's ignition point by guessing. Somebody has to show you, and if that somebody didn't make it through a hard winter, the knowledge sometimes didn't either. So what happened when every backup failed at once? No fatwood nearby. No ember left, rain too heavy for a spark to survive even a second. There was still one last option, and it wasn't luck. It was other people. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer groups that survived into the modern era, from the Kalahari to the Andaman Islands, recorded the same behavior repeatedly. When a group's fire went out completely, someone traveled, sometimes for hours, through the exact storm that killed their own fire, to the nearest camp, to carry back a live coal wrapped and shielded the entire way home. That trip barely shows up in the archaeological record because a borrowed ember leaves no trace behind, no tool, no bone, no layer of ash. But it tells you something enormous about how early human groups actually functioned. They weren't isolated units each fighting the weather alone. They were nodes in a network, and fire was one of the things that network existed to protect, long before anyone had a word for alliance or trade. That safety net had a limit, though, and it's the kind of limit that doesn't show up until you actually need it most. A single storm system could hit an entire region at once, meaning your nearest neighbors were sometimes losing the exact same battle with their own fire at the exact same time, turning borrow an ember from a guarantee into a gamble decided by geography and luck. And rain didn't just threaten the flame directly, it compressed everything around it. Predators pushed out of the open by the same weather sought the same dry caves humans were sheltering in. Archaeologists have found sites in South Africa where human remains and large cat remains turn up in the same layer of sediment, and some of those human bones carry puncture marks that match a leopard's teeth almost perfectly. Losing the fire in that moment wasn't just losing warmth. It was losing the one thing keeping a predator on the other side of the entrance. And a body loses heat to wet air dramatically faster than to dry air, fast enough to tip into real danger within hours, not days. pause. Meanwhile, you're currently annoyed at a smoke detector that won't stop chirping because of a slightly burnt piece of toast. Different century, different problems. So when you put the whole picture together, wet firewood wasn't a minor inconvenience our ancestors shrugged off between hunts. It was one of the most consistent recurring threats they ever faced, quiet, unglamorous, and never making it into the highlight reel next to mammoth hunts and cave paintings. And the response to it wasn't luck. It was generations of tested, accumulated, hand-me-down knowledge: which wood stays dry under a canopy, which resin repels water, which bark hides oil under its skin, which powdered rock cuts a flame's threshold, which fungus holds an ember for hours, and who, specifically, was responsible for making sure none of it ever had to be discovered twice. So next time it's pouring outside and you're irritated the thermostat is taking a few extra minutes to catch up, remember what that same rain used to mean. Somewhere behind the lighter in your pocket, behind the switch on your wall, there's a million years of people sitting in the dark, soaked through, refusing to let the one thing keeping them alive go out. You'll never have to know which wood burns wet and which doesn't, which bark hides oil, which powdered rock cuts an ignition point by 100 degrees, which fungus can hold an ember for hours without a flame. That problem got solved so completely, so long ago, passed through so many hands you'll never know the names of that it doesn't even register as a problem anymore. You just flick the lighter, and it works, and you move on with your day without a second thought. That's the part worth sitting with. Not that ancient humans struggled with wet firewood, but that they struggled with it successfully, over and over, for thousands of generations, refining the same solution slightly further with each one, until the struggle disappeared completely from human memory. Inherited by you as something so small, so automatic, you'd never think to call it a solution at all. If you want to go deeper into any of this, the Qesem cave excavation, the Neanderthal combustion study, the fatwood chemistry, all of it, the research is linked below source by source. And if one detail here genuinely surprised you, put it in the comments below. I read every single one.